Okay, welcome to our first lecture pertaining to the Salem witch trials, which I've titled Calvinism and English Puritanism. But in order to understand what's happening with the Salem witch trials, we have to go back rather far. It's not enough simply to understand something about New England society or Puritanism or Calvinist theology or even just early modern beliefs about witchcraft. I think it's helpful if we actually start at the beginning with a brief history of Christianity, because witchcraft belief and the prosecution of witchcraft is something that is not unique to Christianity, but obviously with regard to the Salem witch trials, we need to understand it in the context of the Christian religion. So where does Christianity itself come from? Well, let's go back to the 9th century BCE and the development of monotheism amongst a particular Canaanite tribe, which the Egyptians called the Hipiru, which, if you are a beady-eyed listener, will realize that sounds a little bit like Hebrew, and you would be right. It is this particular group that is going to decide that their patron god, Yahweh, is in fact the only God in the universe, and that all of the other Canaanite peoples and in fact polytheists, everywhere, are worshiping false religion. And so this is obviously a very long and complicated story. I've got to do it in a very simple and short fashion, but suffice it to say, it is going to be these monotheists who are eventually going to take over most of present-day Palestine, and eventually by the 6th century BCE are going to establish two neighboring kingdoms of Judah and Israel. And it is in Israel that you have the holy city of Jerusalem, where the first temple to Yahweh is built. And so let's have a look at a map where we can sort of see. This is the land that is now present day Israel, Lebanon, part of Egypt and Syria. And here is Jerusalem, here's the Dead Sea, here's the Sea of Galilee connected by the Jordan River. So in any case, what happens is that you have two fairly successful kingdoms, but they are conquered in 586 BCE by the Babylonians, who completely take over the region. They destroy the first temple and scatter the Jews to many different places, and many Jewish elites are in fact forced to live in and around Babylon. Now, this is in present-day Iraq. Okay, and this is an event that is known as the Babylonian captivity, and so it is during roughly this period of the 7th and 6th centuries that you have the composition of the scriptures that comprise the Torah and what eventually become the Old Testament in the Bible. But this Babylonian captivity is short-lived. In 539, the Babylonian Empire is conquered by the neighboring Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. The Persians, of course, are in what is present-day Iran. And Cyrus is a celebrated figure in Judaism because he allows all of the exiles to return to Israel. He allows them to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and to worship their religion freely. But over time, between the 6th century and the 1st century BCE, gradually through various for various reasons that are difficult to get too into. They're complicated, obviously, but Judaism is going to split theologically and politically between two factions, the Pharisees and Sadducees, with a number of smaller groups out there, the most radical of which and the most interesting of which for our purposes will be the Essenes, who will establish a community on the shore of the Dead Sea in a place now called Qumran. And they are the ones who are going to compile the Dead Sea Scrolls, which includes a lot of the copies of a lot of the Old Testament scriptures, but also a lot of their own writings, which are harshly critical of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the intensity of their radicalism is going to increase once we get to the first century and immediately beyond, when Judea falls increasingly under Roman influence. If you know your history, obviously the first century BCE is the period when the Roman Republic, which has expanded all over Italy and much of the Mediterranean world, is going to become the Roman Empire. And so then Palestine is going to fall under Roman influence until by the year 6 of the Common Era, Judea is formally annexed into the Roman Empire as a province and is no longer an independent kingdom. Now, obviously, this coincides very closely with the date of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, who is going to be the founder of Christianity, which historians date at approximately 4 BCE. But although his career as a public figure is not going to start until a bit later than that. So let's take a look. Roughly, this is in 117, so this is well beyond what I was just referencing, but this just gives you a sense of where everything is. Down here is Judea, and then over here, obviously, is Italy and Rome. So, all right. By the year 30 or thereabouts, Jesus of Nazareth becomes a public figure. And what is interesting about him is he is not necessarily a great religious innovator. He is, in fact, an extremely conservative Jew. And what he is most concerned about, and it is believed that he was influenced by the Essenes in this. We're not sure if he was ever a member of that community, but he becomes, with them, extremely critical of the Pharisees and Sadducees, especially the Pharisees, for their collaboration with the Roman government. Jesus of Nazareth is essentially an extremely Orthodox Jew who wants to bring things back to the way things were done before a variety of political and theological compromises were made in the wake of the Roman takeover. And so he becomes an opponent of the Roman government. And this is obviously what's going to bring him into their crosshairs and lead to his being crucified. And then, according to his disciples and his believers, that he rose from the dead after 3 days and continued his ministry for 40 days before transfiguration to heaven. And then after that, we have the growth of what historians call the Jesus movement, which by the year 100 becomes a formally established variant of Judaism that is known as Christianity. As I mentioned, Jesus was an extremely conservative Jew, and a major part of his following after his departure wanted to stay inside of Judaism and reform Judaism, whereas another faction, which was led by Paul, St. Paul, argued that Christianity was a religion for all people, the Gentiles, and not just a Jewish reform movement or a religion only for Jews. And it is Pauline Christianity that is going to win the argument and become the first century and second century Christianity that attempts to be more inclusive. And it's during this period that you have the composition of the various canonical gospels, and indeed many gospel works about the life and sayings of Jesus Christ, reworkings of various Old Testament texts, prophetic texts, the most famous of which, of course, is the book of Revelation, but not the only apocalyptic book that all of them predict to one degree or another Jesus' return, the final defeat of all evil, the glorification of the downtrodden, and the bringing low of the enemies, who are always and frequently equated with the Romans. Okay. And of course, the Romans aren't too keen on this, and they ruthlessly attempt to suppress Christianity. But this only makes Christianity grow and proliferate all over the Mediterranean world. This is the time of the martyrs, right? This is when you have Christians who are variously crucified, burned to death, tortured, made to fight as gladiators in the arena, or sent to be attacked by wild animals in the Colosseum as punishment for simply being Christians, because so many Christians are opponents of Roman rule, especially in Judea. But as Christianity grows, as it becomes, as more and more elites connected to Roman government and Roman commerce become Christians, the anti-Roman orientation becomes more and more of a problem. And so gradually you have a legitimization of Christianity through the suppression of the anti-Roman bias. You have a series of great theologians who emerge, who formalize and codify Christian theology. Okay, and this leads eventually to the career of the Emperor Constantine, who has benefited from a certain connection with Christianity that leads to his making a decree in 313 that Christianity will no longer be a persecuted religion. It will become a legitimate religion of the empire. This is not to mean that Christianity becomes the Roman religion. Throughout this period, the Romans actually were extremely religiously pluralistic. You could practice whatever religion you wanted in the empire as long as you made annual, at least, sacrifices to the Roman pantheon or to the deified emperor. This is something that radical Jews didn't want to do. This was something that Jesus criticized. And this is a thing that got Christians into a lot of trouble. But eventually Constantine decides that it is perfectly okay on grounds of conscience. If you don't want to follow the Roman religion, that is going to be okay, at least as far as it goes with the Christians in any case. It is believed that he may have converted to Christianity on his deathbed. Nobody knows for sure, but what does happen is that by the year 400, Christianity becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire. This is when the Bible is compiled. The canonical Old Testament and New Testament those texts are selected, ordered, and written down as the sacred text of Christianity, which is going to spread throughout the Eastern and Western Roman Empire and into Northern Africa, Europe, and Western Asia. So by this point, it's important to understand that the empire, for various administrative reasons, has had to divide into two large pieces. And the dividing line is roughly right down the geographic center of the empire. Italy on the west side, Greece on the east side. Rome is still the capital of the Roman Empire at this point, but there is now a new city here that was built by Constantine and is known as Constantinople. And it is a secondary capital of the empire and essentially the functioning administrative center for the Eastern Roman Empire. And that's going to be important for understanding what happens with Christianity later on. Okay, so here we are looking at the Western Empire, and the problem that we have here in the late 300s and early 400s is that the empire is becoming too large physically. It's too expensive to maintain. Borders are increasingly difficult to defend against the barbarian tribes and states that surround Rome and in fact exist inside of Roman territory here. And what happens is that these peoples variously test those boundaries, push against them, tear them down, and what this will result in ultimately is, by 450, the complete collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The city of Rome itself is sacked in 410. The invaders eventually are bought off and allowed to, and made to leave. But in 450, others return and take the city permanently. And what happens is that the Western Empire collapses. The Eastern Empire goes on and prospers and perseveres. But what happens from 450 up until the 1000s is a chaotic period during which the absence of Roman imperial administration results in the reconstituting of various Roman provinces into nation states, specifically places like the Kingdom of the Franks, right? That is going to be France. The rise of the English monarchy, Spanish kingdoms, and various other places. So what happens also at this same time, this is the time of the Christianization of Europe. Missionaries proliferate throughout the Western Empire, converting pagan rulers to Christianity, or otherwise just simply converting the people to Christianity. Now, this is obviously much easier said than done, since these people have their own native religions that they've been practicing literally for hundreds or thousands of years in many cases. And while the Christians are gradually and slowly successful in establishing Christianity, they have more trouble suppressing certain pagan beliefs, practices, festival days, and whatnot. And what the Christians do, essentially, is they find ways to just simply co-opt these things and just rebrand pagan ideas and pagan celebrations as Christian ideas and Christian celebrations. Good examples of this are Christmas and Easter. Historians have known for a very, very long time, that Jesus of Nazareth certainly was never born in the month of December, much less December 25th. He was most likely born sometime in early June. But then why celebrate his birth at Christmas? Because the Christians simply could not stop people in the Western Empire, the old Western Empire, from practicing winter solstice festivals. And also in the Eastern Empire, there was a thriving cult of Mithras, whose birthday was celebrated on December 25th, and they couldn't seem to stop that, so they just simply rebrand it as Jesus' birthday. Same with Easter. You have a spring festival celebrating the return, of fertility and whatnot, and so. Okay, this is, this coincides with Passover, so this is perfect. We can just rebrand Easter celebrations as a Christian holiday. Same with pagan holy sites are being transformed into Christian holy sites. So if you have places where there are pagan shrines or pagan holy places, you just plunk a chapel or a cathedral on the spot, and therefore you're just holy ground remains holy ground. It's just now holy for a different reason. So let me give you an example. Near Cambridge in England is a place called Holywell. And it was a sacred site for thousands of years to the pagan English. And what the Christians simply did was decide that Christian miracles occurred at the same place, and it just simply, and this is literally the holy well that you're looking at, and they just plunk a cross in the middle of it, and then a little statue, and there you go, boom. Pagan site becomes a Christian holy site. But what's interesting for our purposes is that obviously it is impossible to fully eradicate every non-Christian belief and practice, and once you get into the medieval period, any continued adherence to non-Christian beliefs and practices increasingly become associated with satanic affiliation and witchcraft. So let's bear that in mind. So in that period of the 1000s, an interesting thing that we should bear in mind is that there are increasing questions over who has ultimate temporal authority over the church, over the Christian church. Obviously, Jesus is the spiritual head of the church, but who's the temporal head? The Bishop of Rome says, I am. The Patriarch of Constantinople says, I am. So you see the division of the Roman Empire between the East and the West is exactly now replicated in a division of Christianity between those who push the case for the Bishop of Rome against those who push the case of the Patriarch of Constantinople. And this results in 1054 in what's called the Great Schism. And the formation of the Roman Catholic Church in the West, the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. For all intents and purposes, the differences in theology, doctrine, and liturgical practices between Catholicism and the Orthodox Church are comparatively minor. Just the Catholics are, for instance, more fixated on Jesus's divinity, whereas the Orthodox are more interested in Jesus's humanity. Catholic clergy are forbidden from marrying because it's believed that they need to devote themselves entirely to the spiritual life, whereas the Eastern Orthodox clergy are encouraged to marry because they believe that they are just as bound as anybody else by God's command to be fruitful and multiply. So not important to get too much into this except to understand that we now have two very broad theological differences that will bring conflict. So the next great date to bear in mind in all of this is the year 1095. This is when Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade. At this point, you have the in the 700s and 800s the rise and spread of Islam, which sees itself as a continuation and an improvement upon Christianity, and it has spread from Saudi Arabia into all of the Near East, including obviously Palestine. And so Pope Urban II calls for a crusade to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Saracen infidels. And this also marks a turning point for the Catholic Church, because up to this point, while the Catholic Church has been growing in power and influence, it emerges as the leading political and financial power in Europe. And wielding this power includes the vigorous suppression of any Christian theology that is not officially sanctioned by the Pope. Okay, as I mentioned before, there are a great many different kinds of Christianity going back to its founding. But these were gradually, brought together for the most part during that period from the 400s all the way through the 1000s. But those other church variants are still kind of out there, but they're mostly on the margins. But every so often, obviously, some church figure or 10 come along and believe something a little bit divergent from what most of the others are following. This is true. This is true for the Eastern Orthodox, as a matter of fact. But the Catholic Church is more militant about the suppression of what they believe to be heresy. And part of their campaign against heresy is the establishment of institutions of higher learning to churn out proper, and when I say Orthodox, I don't mean capital O, but just proper Catholic clergy in Europe. This is where your great universities come from: Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge. Okay, and this is an attempt by the Catholic Church to control European intellectual life, to suppress heresy, and they're not going to just rely on making the arguments. If you are a known heretic, you're going to be a target. And the Holy Inquisition is just one of those means by which that they would come after you, and of course torture and execution, excommunication are certainly tools of the Inquisition to keep people in line. In keeping with this growing power of the church, it starts to show up on the landscape. Enormous amounts of wealth pays for the building of ambitious, enormous cathedrals all over Western and Central Europe, as well as palaces for bishops, cardinals, and popes to live in. And this is going to eventually result in some hard questions asked as far as this accumulation of worldly power, and calls from certain quarters that there should be a reformation of the church to make it more like what it used to be in the first century, to get back strictly to the things that Jesus said and taught. And occasionally this would fire ordinary people up to challenge the power of the church. But of course, between the power of the church and its political influence, these are all put down. It's very important to understand that the Catholic Church, specifically the Pope, has the authority to countenance anybody who ascends to be a crowned head anywhere in Central or Western Europe. If you're going to be a king of France, for instance, or a king of England or wherever, you are not legitimate until the Pope has ratified your succession by anointing you with oil. So this is presumed to argue that the Pope is above all others. Now, some kings and some queens are going to contend against this, but suffice it to say, by the 14th and 15th centuries, the church has incredible power. And obviously, this is going to lead to some soul searching and some hard questions asked. And those either brave enough or foolish enough to raise those questions are going to feel the power of the church to shut them up. And again, the Inquisition is a big part of that, but this is also where you start to have campaigns to find and hunt down witches, because one of the church's ways of explaining where heresies come from or why ordinary people follow heretical leaders, among many other things, is that they might be influenced by witches who are Satan's foot soldiers. Now, like I said, certain individuals are brave and or foolish enough to stand up and openly criticize the church for this exercise of power and its accumulation of wealth. And I will give you three among many who existed at that time. The first would be John Wycliffe in England in the 1380s. All of their complaints are going to be more essentially the same. The church should not be so politically involved. The church should not be so fabulously wealthy. The church should be doing more for the poor. The church should be doing more to commit themselves to spiritual guidance. And the church's response to all of these is going to be a polite invitation for said critics to shut up If they refuse, then they will start to risk being accused of heresy. And the punishment for heresy and a refusal to recant is that you will be excommunicated and most likely then executed by burning at the stake. This is not exactly what happens with Wycliffe. He dies of natural causes, but the growth of the Lollard movement that he started in England is so distressing that the church, brands Lollardy a heresy. Wycliffe is tried posthumously in a papal court, found guilty of heresy. His body is exhumed and burned along with as many copies of his books as can be collected. Of course, the church would prefer to do all these things while you're alive, and so this is what's going to happen with Jan Hus and Girolamo Savonarola. Jan Hus was a would-be reformer coming out of Bohemia. This is in Central Europe, just a little bit next to Germany, and again, same basic criticisms of the church, and for which he was found guilty of heresy and burned at the stake. Savonarola compounded his problems by opposing the very powerful Italian noble family, the de Medicis. So he was critical of them. He was, several of the popes were de Medicis. He was critical of them. He was critical of the church, and so of course he was tried for heresy, found guilty, burned at the stake along with copies of his books. And for some reason, it still escapes me a little bit, they gathered all of these up and shot them out of a cannon across the Tiber River in Rome. I don't know what point that last bit proves, but there you go. Suffice it to say, if you raise your voice in criticism, you're going to probably come to regret it. And that brings us to Martin Luther, an obscure parish priest in southern Germany, who, again, is concerned about the wealth and power of the church. And he's most concerned about a new money-raising scheme the church is engaged in, known as the sale of indulgences. Now, what does that mean? Well, for that, you need to kind of understand something basically about Christian beliefs about the afterlife. And that is, obviously, Christians believe that if you're a good boy or girl, you're going to go to heaven when you die. If you're a bad boy or girl, you're going to go to hell when you die. In Catholic theology, of course, when you die, if you were, as flawlessly pious and good a person as you could reasonably be, and faithful, you will go directly to heaven. Do not pass go. No need for $200. Consequently, if you were flawlessly cruel and vicious and terrible and impious, then absolutely straight to hell you're going to go. But the vast majority of those who die are going to find themselves in a place called purgatory, a place sort of between heaven and hell, an unpleasant, uncomfortable place, but it's the place where you're going to serve penance for your ordinary sins. And you're going to be there for a set period of time depending upon the severity of your sins. Obviously, the worse they are, the longer you're going to be there. And in purgatory, time has no meaning relative to time here on earth. So you could be in purgatory for tens of thousands of years as far as you experience it, before you finally have atoned for your sins and can go on to heaven. The great Italian poet Dante, for instance, imagined purgatory as a great mountain, and when you reach the foot of the mountain, your sins are a rock that you have to carry on your back, and you have to carry it up the mountain. And as you ascend the mountain, that rock gets gradually smaller and lighter until by the time you get to the summit of the mountain, it becomes a speck of dust that then poof goes away, and then your body ascends through a curtain of of excruciatingly hot blue flame that burns off the last taint of original sin, and then you go to heaven. But he commented about how some people clearly had enormous sins because all he could see of them was just these giant boulders that were barely moving at all. And others he could see farther up the mountain having a little bit of an easier time of it. But obviously people are deeply concerned about the fact that they have to consider, I'll probably go to purgatory and I'll probably be there a long time. Is there any way I can get my sentence in purgatory reduced? For the vast majority of people, of course, the answer is, well, no. For elites, for nobles, many members of their families are going to have careers in the church. Some of them are going to get to be cardinals and archbishops and popes and whatnot. And so they have an in, right? They have nuns, members of their family who are nuns and other male members of their family in the clergy who are going to pray for their souls and take care of them. But nevertheless, the Catholic Church comes up with this scheme to raise money by selling indulgences, which are basically these slips of paper that essentially permit the bearer to have a certain period of time in purgatory remitted. The more money you spend, the more time off of purgatory you get. And right away you're thinking, wow, this would have been great for the nobles, right? Because they have lots of money. But nobles are already giving lots of money to the church. You're required to anyway, right? Everybody has to tithe. But then, of course, nobles do more than that. They give more money to the church. They donate land and money to build monasteries and nunneries and churches and chapels and whatnot. They are not going to be the prime market for indulgences. The prime market, obviously, is going to be for artisan class, the would-be gentry, but especially the poor people. And that is where enormous sums are coming from people who already can't really afford to do it. And this greatly offends Father Martin. And so he thinks about the worldly power of the church and this business of indulgences and comes up with 95 points of debate that he wants the church to have towards reforming itself. And of course, the church is not in the least bit interested in hearing such a thing, and they politely, invite him to shut up, and he won't. And becomes critical of the Pope and the church generally. And so he is summoned to a church trial at the Diet of Worms in 1521, where he is convicted of heresy and excommunicated. And then he is told to go home and get his stuff together and expect to be arrested later. But they dangle the prospect that maybe if he's willing to recant, they might forgive him. But he doesn't believe it's going to happen, and then he goes into exile. And during his exile, he translates the Bible into German and becomes an even more strident anti-Catholic spiritual leader. He begins to believe that the establishment of the Catholic Church was something that was not engineered by God, but was in fact engineered by Satan, and that the popes and the archbishops and all that are actually tools of Satan, to the point where he suggests that whenever the Antichrist arrives, he will be a pope. Now, among many other things, he argues that there should be nothing beyond the priest as far as any kind of church authority should be. He does not believe in bishops or archbishops, cardinals, or popes. He says the Bible has nothing to say about such things and that they don't exist. Purgatory itself does not exist. It's a fantasy and devised, to his mind, to do nothing but sell indulgences. And so there's only just heaven and there's only just hell. Although he still believes that most people are ultimately probably going to go to heaven when they die. Um, but he argues that everybody ought to be able to read the Bible. He pushes for universal literacy, for instance. He believes that the truths of Christianity are readily apparent to anyone who can read the Bible in their own language. He believes that church services should be conducted in the vernacular instead of in the Latin that nobody except church people and the occasional doctor or lawyer understands. And he says that most of the people equate the priesthood with magicians and wizards, and that this is an extremely dangerous thing to allow to continue. So he starts talking about refuting the Catholic Church's authority. And this is going to take off in certain parts of the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, because one thing, especially lots of dukes and duchesses and princes like to hear, is the fact that they could break from Rome and therefore keep a lot of the money that they normally would have to send to Rome in tithes, which would make their countries richer and hopefully could allow them to build more power. And peasants loved Lutheran theology for its anti-authoritarianism, but of course they took it too far. They thought it meant, oh, if I don't have to follow the Pope, I don't have to follow the king. I don't have to follow my landlord. And so this, in the 1520s, there were a series of peasant uprisings that are ruthlessly suppressed by the German nobility with Luther's blessing. Luther is abundantly clear that I'm not interested in toppling, secular government or authority. I'm only talking about changing the way we think about spiritual authority. So, all right. Now, he believes the idea of priesthood of all believers. He thinks that everyone who reads the Bible will come to the exact same conclusions that he did. But as you can imagine, what I read in the Bible is going to be one thing, what you read is going to be another thing, and what still somebody else is going to be yet another thing. And this is going to lead in the 16th century to an explosion of unique theological movements, sectarian formation, and the beginnings of what we call denominationalism. That being said, though, this doesn't do anything to dent the appeal and the popularity of Protestantism. Much of Northern Europe is going to renounce the Church of Rome and become Protestant. And the church is not going to take this lying down and is going to brand any and all Protestant theologies as heresies and go after its leaders and its followers through a campaign known as the Counter-Reformation, which is comprised of three angles of attack. The first is ideological. So we have our universities, right? So they make sure that they're churning out doctrinally pure clergy, and also make sure that those clergymen and those students and those professors churn out scholarship that refutes any and all Protestant ideas. Political, right? That's Catholic, or I should say, the legitimacy and authority of Protestant rulers should always be undermined by any means necessary, and very closely followed by military. Let's make sure that good Catholic nations stand up against their Protestant neighbors and defeat them on the battlefield. And this is what's going to lead to the worst of these conflicts, and that is the 30 Years' War in 1618. So, all right, here's a look at what used to be the old Western Empire, right? You remember the dividing line is right through here. But look at Central and Central Europe and into Western Europe. You can see that we have a significant degree of compromising papal authority or Catholic authority. So, if we were to see a map like this for 1500, all of this would be green. All of this would be nice and green and easy to understand. But by now, it's starting to get more and more complicated and messy. So, This bears directly on our topic when we think about how part of the Counter-Reformation was going after heretics, and there was a lot of equation of heresy with adherence to occult beliefs, occult practices, Satanism, and witchcraft. And what happens is that 1530s begins a rather long period, one that ultimately lasts nearly 2 full centuries of ruthless attacks upon mostly women, but pretty much anybody who might be doing something or suspected of doing something that looks like witchcraft. And this, of course, is worse in Central Europe, where the conflict between Protestants and Catholics was most heated. And before things tend to die down by the middle of the 18th century, nearly 100,000 people were accused of witchcraft and nearly 50,000 executed by burning at the stake. You dispose of witches exactly the same way as you would dispose of a heretic. So, okay, this is going to lead us to understanding something about one variant of Lutheranism that will become its own theology, and that is Calvinism. And it starts with a French lawyer named John Calvin, or I should say Jean Calvin. And he converts to Lutheranism relatively early in his life. But if you live in France, bear in mind that France is a firmly Catholic country. It is against the law to be a Protestant, and being caught as a Protestant means the death penalty. Calvin is a lawyer and knows this extremely well, and so he realizes that he cannot go on living in France as a Protestant, and he moves to Geneva, Switzerland, and begins to study Lutheran theology, but more importantly, he begins to study the Bible more deeply, and he believes that Luther only got halfway there as far as getting to what true Christianity is, and that he has done that, and he publishes it in a 2-volume book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And this and Calvinism is going to be a very important part of our understanding what's going to happen with English history and the formation of New England. But let's understand something about this Calvinism first. So Calvinism is comprised of 5 points. And every one of them ultimately is rooted in something that Calvin argued that too many theologians have taken for granted and then essentially ignored, and that is God's absolute omniscience and omnipotence. And that if you understand his omniscience, you understand that everything that happens is something that has already been ordained by God. In fact, that before the first act of creation, God knew the exact course of the entire temporal history of the universe, right down to the path of a dust mote floating in the air, to say nothing of the bigger events. And if you understand that, and you understand that God is an infinite being, and that human beings are definitely not, they're definitely finite individuals, you understand this first point, total inability. So, when I die, where am I going to go? Well, Luther's dispensed with purgatory, right? Calvin, absolutely. There is no such thing as purgatory. There's just heaven and there's just hell. But in the Catholic scheme, as you've heard me say, most people are ultimately going to end up in heaven, either directly or in most cases they're going to get there eventually. But Calvin said that is rubbish. That original sin, in fact, was so heinous a crime, because it was the first crime of disobedience against God. It is so heinous, and it is something that is carried by all of Adam and Eve's progeny, i.e. all of humanity, that original sin alone is more than enough to warrant damnation, and that it takes divine, infinite mercy on God's part to allow any souls into his presence in heaven. And so, because of original sin, because of the essential finite quality of humanity, the individual is absolutely helpless before God and can do nothing to deserve, much less achieve, salvation, right? So, Catholic and other, priests and ministers tell you all the time, you've got to go to church, you've got to read the Bible, you've got to pray, you've got to do good deeds, you've got to be a good person. Calvin was a lawyer, remember, and lawyers know very well, why do people follow the law? They follow the law not because it's the right thing to do. They follow the law because they're afraid to get punished. Okay? And they break the law because they get a thrill from doing so. They like getting away with something and to hell with any kind of consequences on that. So if you're driving down the road and the speed limit is 60 miles an hour and you push it, you set your cruise control for 65, you feel a little naughty. You feel like, I don't care. They're probably not going to get me. I'm not going to care. But then when you see the blue and red lights behind you, you feel that thrill of fear-induced adrenaline. And what do? Oh, you suddenly slow down. You don't just keep doing 65 and wave at the cop and pull over and say, hey, good job, you got me. No, as soon as you see the cop, you slow down because, I better follow. You're following the law because you're afraid, according to Calvin. People follow God's laws not because they're the right thing to do and that you should do them for no other reason, that you should do them because you don't expect any kind of reward or punishment for not doing so. No, people want to go to heaven because heaven is a place where you have all kinds of joy and delight. Hell is a scary place where you're going to be punished forever and tortured by Satan and all his little devils. You then follow the law because you want the pleasure and you want to avoid the pain. But you're not doing those things for the right reasons. And this, he says, is what's going to condemn the vast majority of human beings to hell. Very few are going to go to heaven. But if you are a recipient of grace, it is unconditional. It has nothing whatsoever to do with anything you've ever said, done, wanted, felt, thought, or believed. So you're told, go to church, help old ladies across the street, give money to charity, follow the law, be a good person. Calvin says you should be doing those things without any expectation of reward and without fear of punishment for not doing so. Okay? If you do those things, most people are doing it because they're trying to earn points. And they're therefore are doing it for the wrong reason. So, you should do them, but not because you expect to get anything for it and not because you fear what might happen if you don't do it. So if you receive election, as he called it, it has nothing to do with anything you've done. You are innately unworthy, but God's infinite mercy is willing to spread itself on you such that you can be admitted into his presence when you die. Okay? That leads us to a question. If most people are going to hell, why did Christ shed his blood? Didn't he shed his blood for everybody? That's the Catholic idea. That's what a lot of other people believe. But Calvin said, no. Why would Jesus sacrifice himself for the damned, for people who constantly reject him in various forms every minute of every day of their lives? Whether they do it consciously or unconsciously, it doesn't matter. No. Calvin said Christ died only for the elect. And as I said, relatively few are going to heaven. Most are going to be going to hell. Okay, so Fourth point. All right. If you're a recipient of grace, you are, of course, because of total inability, are absolutely helpless to reject. You cannot reject it. But then, of course, why would you, right? And this leads us into a lot of the stuff about predestination, right? Do you have free will, right? Could you choose to be damned? And Calvin says, well, of course you can, because most people are going to do that. They're going to consciously turn their backs on Christ, or they're going to practice faith under false pretenses. They choose things all the time. But it doesn't matter in the end what you've done, what you've thought. He says works mean nothing without faith, and you have to have faith that God will has made the right decision for you. But he says you still have free will. It's just that God knows what your decisions are going to be. It's not that he specifically made you in a certain way. It's just that he knows what's going to happen. But if you are a recipient of grace, obviously it's irresistible. And once in line with it's being irresistible, it is irrevocable, right? So once you have it, you cannot lose it. You are completely regenerated. Okay? So, in theory, it is possible to be the most saintly person, someone who's selflessly committed to Christ's teachings and doing the right things and will be among the elect. It's just as likely for the same kind of person to not be among the elect. And these reasons are God's and God's alone. Conversely, obviously, if you are a vicious, horrible kind of person, you like to kill puppies and kittens and, rape and pillage and steal and fornicate and all of those things, yes, very likely you're going straight to hell. But it is possible that at some point, even possibly late in such a horrible person's life, they may receive grace and be regenerated, in which case, if that happens, they become incapable of doing the things that they used to do before their conversion. They still remember it. They will feel for the rest of their lives, obviously, an immense sorrow and regret at their former lives, but they have become incapable of wanting to do those things, much less of doing those things later. So yes, in theory, somebody's most sainted neighbor or grandparent or whatever might go straight to hell, whereas you might be a recipient of grace, go to heaven, and find Adolf Hitler there. Not likely, of course, but it is theoretically possible. This is where the Calvinist argues that faith is very important, right? You have to have faith that the universe is designed and ordered in exactly the way it is supposed to be. In fact, this led one early 19th century Calvinist theologian to argue that the damned should praise their damnation and go to hell cheerfully, which even most of his colleagues said that's asking an awful lot of the damned, because after all, I mean, if you are heading down that escalator and you're saying, oh, praise God for my damnation, and this is like, you would think that God would hit the stop button and say, hang on, come back up here, wait a minute, maybe I misjudged you. Well, that's not possible, right? But but still. All right, back to the history. So, okay, Calvinism is going to play a part in this event called the English Reformation. So we have the Protestant Reformation happening on the continent. In the same time, this is when King Henry VIII is the King of England, and he's a good Catholic boy. He hates Lutheranism and all things associated with Protestantism. He's married to his former sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon. She was originally the wife of his brother Arthur, who was the heir to the throne, but Arthur died unexpectedly, and that made Henry the heir to the throne. And so he married Catherine and ascended to become King Henry VIII. And he wants a divorce later from her because she gave birth to a daughter by him, but cannot seem to get pregnant with a male child, at least not one that she can carry to term. And he begins to think that maybe he's committed a sin of incest. Of course, according to biblical law, he has. And so he says, I need a divorce from the Pope. And Pope Julius II refuses to do it because Catherine is the sister of the Holy Roman Emperor, and so it's a political thing. He tries to make the argument, no, you don't understand. Okay, I need an annulment because we never consummated the marriage. Well, little Mary toddling around is proof that that's not true. So what he does is he begins to have concerns about the power of the church, and this it leads him to a conflict with his Archbishop of Canterbury, and he begins to argue that that monarchies should have jurisdiction over the clergy in their kingdoms, i.e. his. Obviously, the Archbishop is not going to agree with this, and this is going to cause more tension with Rome. In the meanwhile, he begins to see Anne Boleyn, one of Catherine's ladies' maids, and she is from a Protestant family, and she encourages Henry to deny the Pope's authority. In 1533, I've got a misprint right there. That's 1533. Anne gives birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. And the following year, Henry formally breaks the English Church from Rome and declares the formation of the independent Church of England, and then marries Anne. Now, this Church of England is every bit as Catholic as the Church of Rome. The only difference is that it no longer sends money to Rome. It no longer has a connection to Rome, but it is otherwise Catholic. This is very important to bear this in mind. Again, Henry is a good Catholic boy, and he wants to stay a good Catholic boy. But he wants to be able to divorce a woman who cannot give him a viable heir to the throne. And by claiming royal supremacy over the clergy, he can do this. So he is the head of the Church of England, not the Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay, so from 1533 to, and again, this is another little misprint, I should say, 1537, Anne and her family become enmeshed in political intrigues and scandals. She's accused of incest with her brother, for instance, and then there's political issues with the Boleyn family that ultimately lead her to being arrested and tried, found guilty of treason and incest, and she's executed in 1536. Henry then marries her lady's maid, Jane Seymour, who dies giving birth to his son, Edward, in 1537. And then we have three more women that he marries. There's no more pregnancies, no more children. His last wife, Catherine Parr, urges Henry to reform the Church of England to be along more Lutheran lines, and he gives in to this to some extent and finalizes assertion of total royal control over church land. The problem here, of course, is that Edward by then is 10 years old. He was a sickly, frail baby when he was born. He was always a sickly and frail child. He was never expected to survive childhood, but he somehow manages to hang on and becomes King Edward VI. But again, he's expected to die almost literally at any point in the near future. And so Catholic and Protestant factions in the court and in Parliament are going to jockey for a position to secure the succession for Mary on the part of the Catholics, and the Protestants are going to push the case for Elizabeth. But the Catholics are more influential and more powerful. And when Edward VI does die in 1553, Mary ascends to the throne and begins a notorious rule in which she vows to avenge her mother, who, by the way, Catherine of Aragon was never executed or anything like that. She was just exiled to a castle somewhere. But but she's going to bring England back to the Catholic fold, and she starts hoping that she can literally purge England of all Protestants by literally hunting them, all of these heretics down through the machinery of the Holy Inquisition. So many executions, torture, and bloodshed that she becomes known as Bloody Mary. She becomes deeply unpopular among her own people for this, and not least also because she marries the King Philip II of Spain, and Spain is a rival. And a deeply, Catholic country, right? And so this marriage is extremely unpopular. And this is what's going to allow Protestants to ascend in terms of power and public sympathy, right? And throughout this period, this is where you see the rise of Calvinism amongst radical English Protestants, right? So in 1558, Queen Mary dies and is succeeded by her half-sister, Queen Elizabeth I. So the Protestants, as I said, gain the advantage over the Catholics, and Elizabeth succeeds to the throne. Philip II believes he ought to be King of England because he was married to the Queen, and the Queen's dead. That makes him king, right? And he tried to press this case to the point of trying to invade England in 1588, but that was a crashing failure. But when Elizabeth ascended to the throne, of course, England's Protestants got very excited, especially those who are Calvinists, those that were known as Puritans. They're looking to try to get rid of everything in the Church of England that looks like, Catholicism. But Elizabeth makes it abundantly clear that she's going to maintain the Church of England as her father defined it by the end of his life, and that she's not going to tolerate the Puritans pushing her to go further with reforms and the adoption of Calvinist theology as the official theology of the Church of England. Okay, that notwithstanding, Protestantism begins to become more deeply rooted in England, and Catholicism begins to diminish in power, influence, and popularity over the course of the relatively long reign of Queen Elizabeth. As you know, she was the Virgin Queen. She, probably not really a virgin, but she never married, and never had children. And so, when she dies, she is succeeded in 1603 by a distant cousin, King James VI of Scotland, and he assumes the throne of England, becomes King James I of England, and declares the union of his kingdom with those of England and Ireland. So this is the beginning of Great Britain. Not something that's going to be formalized until 1707, but more or less this is the beginnings of Greater Britain anyway. What's interesting is that James is a Scottish Presbyterian. Presbyterians are Calvinists. So Puritans believe they have an opportunity here to push him to complete the English Reformation and establish Calvinism as the official theology of the Church of England, but he won't do it for a variety of political reasons. But what's interesting for our purposes is that James is famous for writing a book called Demonology in 1597, which is a manual for discovering witches and prosecuting them. And in Scotland, he was known for trying to winkle out, witches who he believed were after him and trying to undermine him. And when they were captured, he often personally oversaw their interrogation, their torture, and would sign their death warrants himself. So he was deeply worried about the existence of witches in Scotland and elsewhere, and so this is going to ramp up concerns about occult practices still existing amongst ordinary people in Britain. So, okay. Now, let's talk about Puritanism a little bit, and let's understand something. Going back to Henry and Mary, and especially Elizabeth, those who adhere to this radical Calvinist theology, who become known as Puritans, fall into two groups. The vast majority of Puritans are what I call mainstream Puritans, and they are mainstream in that they still claim a connection to the Church of England. They still consider themselves to be clergy of the Church of England and adherents of the Church of England, and that they are simply working toward reform of the Church of England from within, right? That's the majority of Puritans. But some still more radical Puritans, followers of a guy named Robert Brown, argue that the evidence shows that between Mary, Elizabeth, and James, that England has no interest in instituting true Christianity, and that God's judgment on England has been sealed and it will be devastating, and that they had better leave. These are known as Separatists. So they are Puritans who will exist outside of the Church of England. They refuse to connect themselves or associate themselves with it. And many of them, in fact, are going to move to Holland because Puritanism is not terribly popular in the higher political circles of England. And as I mentioned, Elizabeth and her successors have no patience for Puritanism. But those who are extremely strident are going to have just as much trouble theoretically as any Catholic who tries to prop up and cause trouble. And so best to leave, best to go to a place where you can practice your religion freely and wait for God to sink England and the British Isles, into the ocean. Where were Puritans most prevalent? Where were Puritans most powerful? Well, it is here in an area of Britain and England proper known as East Anglia. So here you have the city of London. Here is Cambridgeshire. Obviously, you have the university town of Cambridge. Over here is Oxfordshire, where Oxford exists. But these four counties, Cambridgeshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex, is the Puritan heartland. A lot of the place names that you find here, you're going to see replicated in New England. So and also, in fact, if you go to this area today, the accent, the way people speak English there, sounds very similar to the famous or infamous New England accent, that kind of thing. So this is kind of an interesting thing. So to finish up, something that the English Puritans are going to hold in their hearts and minds is a vivid memory of the persecutions under Queen Mary and the fear that they will suffer them again. And the touchstone text for what English Protestants endured during Mary's reign was compiled and written up by, again, a guy named John Fox, who wrote a book called Acts and Monuments of These Latter and Perilous Days, Touching Matters of the Church, also known as the Book of Martyrs. And it is nothing but a chronicle of these various individuals who stood up to Mary or otherwise just insisted on following their Protestant beliefs and were killed for doing so. And this was a heavily illustrated volume. And this is one of the illustrations. And if you look at the caption, it says, "A lamentable spectacle of three women with a silly infant bursting out of the mother's womb, being first taken out of the fire and cast in again, and so all burned together on the Isle of Guernsey, July 18th, 1556. So you'll recall, this is during the reign of Queen Mary. It's pretty graphic, obviously. And it's a horrifying story. We don't know if this really happened or not exactly. We know that people were burned at the stake all over England for being Protestant. But whether this specific thing happened, we can't be sure. But what it did do was it galvanized opposition to Mary. It galvanized, any kind of Puritan identity against the government, okay, and against the Church of England, which sanctioned a lot of this, this torture. And the concern was that this persecution might revive, although it certainly would no longer be Catholic on Protestant, but it might be Anglican on Puritan, and that Puritans must always be vigilant. And it's this kind of thing that's going to energize some Puritans to decide to relocate to the virgin forests of North America in order to establish what they believe is the ideal government, the ideal polity, based on the precepts of the ideal church. And they're always on the lookout for enemies. They're always on the lookout for their opponents. And obviously, the true church is one that Satan is not going to tolerate and is going to enlist all the tools at his disposal to attack. And that means in the New World, it's going to mean the Indians. It's going to mean anyone who is not a Puritan, and definitely anyone who decides to sign over their allegiance to Satan and in exchange receive certain supernatural powers and thereby become witches. So with that, I'll leave it there. We will have, in the next lecture, we will talk about the founding of New England and how the notion of its being a city on a hill is going to contribute to New England Puritan fears about satanic attack. So thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next time.